Okay, well, looks like we're just about a minute or so early, but I needed to set up my camera properly. Let me just adjust this a little bit. Okay, well, I want to welcome those of you that are with us here today. This is the fourth Saturday of the month, and normally I would have a live Bible study, and this room would be full of people. But because this is Thanksgiving weekend, I've decided to move that study back to last week. And last week we taught on the first of 4 parts of the Feast of Dedication from John 10:22. Excuse me a second, got an itch in my eye. Now, we're going to be doing part 2 on December 16th, I think it is. And then we'll finish it in January after the Feast of Dedication. But today I want to talk to you about the War of Gog and Magog from Ezekiel 38 and 39. Now, several weeks ago we did a prophecy conference at North Heights Lutheran Church, and because the other speaker was going to be talking, I knew he was going to be speaking from Ezekiel 38 and 39 because he always does. I chose not to teach from Ezekiel 38 and 39 because I really didn't want to have any conflicts or contradictions between me and him. Although we are essentially on the same wavelength, although there are some minor understandings in the interpretation both of the Hebrew and of the Greek that people make in general. Partly because some of the translations of the Bibles are not translated properly. However, let me grab my clicker here for just a second. So, what I'm going to do is, this is coming from a book that the working title was Understanding Our Times, the Imminent Return of Jesus, or not. But I've changed the title, and it's still a working title, and it'll be released. Hopefully, I'm going to start releasing a couple of ebooks, chapters or portions of chapters when I get back from vacation in January. I'm taking a couple of weeks off to write. But the working title is, Are We There Yet? The Imminent Return of Jesus, What You Need to Know. So, I'm going to start this way by introducing it. See, over 2,000 years ago, Peter, Andrew, and John believed that they were in the end times. Now, we read about this in Matthew 24, Mark 13, Luke 21, and when they thought they were in the end times, they were really right, because you have to understand that God is omnipotent or omnipresent. He exists outside of time. That's why the psalmist in Psalm 90, verse 4, wrote that to the Lord a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like a day. Now, Peter, of course, understanding that, he actually quoted it in in his second letter, in chapter 3, verse 8. So, he understood that God is omnipresent and omnipotent. But ask yourself this question. If you were living in those days, would you have been prepared? John, Andrew, Peter, they were. The question here is, are you prepared now? Because if we read in Matthew 24, verse 36, we see that, or we read that only the Father knows. In other words, he could come at any time. In Peter and Andrew's and John's time, many of the signs had already occurred or were occurring. Some, however, are yet to come. So let's look at the scripture, and let me start with a little bit of review and try to put yourself into their shoes. In Matthew 24:2, we read that the temple must be destroyed. Solomon's temple was already destroyed. That was in 661 BC, and the prophet Zechariah warned of the destruction of that temple. And Nebuchadnezzar, the second after the siege of Jerusalem in 587 BC, well, he burned the temple and took most of the artifacts to Babylon. In the apostles' day, Herod's temple still stood. And only John lived long enough to actually see the temple destroyed again. Peter believed he was in the last days. In 2 Peter 3, it was clear to Peter that he was witnessing the events prophesied about the last days. 2 Peter 3:3, this is the King James Version, he writes, knowing this first, that there shall come in the last days scoffers walking after their own lusts. So, what are the signs? As I taught a couple of weeks ago at the Prophecy Conference, there are 22 signs that precede Yeshua's, Jesus' return. Yeshua is his Hebrew name. We find that in Matthew 23:37 through the end of Matthew 24, verse 51. For the purposes of this lesson, I'm going to use Matthew 23:37 through Matthew 24:51. However, this material can also be found in Mark 13 and in Luke 13:34 and 35, that's the verses, and Luke 21. So the first sign is that Yeshua will return to Jerusalem when Jewish believers will welcome him, saying, Baruch haba b'Hashem Adonai, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. That's found in Matthew 23:37 through 39 and Luke 13, verses 34 and 35. Now let me explain this though. Baruch haba is a traditional welcome to someone that would come to your house. If you were to come to my son's house in Ramat Gan in Israel, it's a suburb of Tel Aviv, you would expect probably from this country for him to greet you with the word shalom, but that's not how he would greet you. He would greet you Baruch haba, blessings. However, if President Donald Trump, or even for that matter our former president Barack Obama, who is I believe is a Muslim, if he showed up, he would have a formal greeting. Baruch haba b'Hashem Adonai. Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And that's what Yeshua, that's what Jesus is saying. When there are enough Jewish believers in Jerusalem to welcome him, like they did on Palm Sunday when he rode into Jerusalem on a donkey, then, and only then, will he come back, will he return. Now, that means there must be enough Jewish believers in Jerusalem to welcome Yeshua, to welcome Jesus on his return to the holy city. Currently, with somewhere between 10 and 15,000 Jewish believers in Eretz Yisrael, the land of Israel, we have a way to go. Although I just read a newsletter from Mitch Glazer, the president of Chosen People Ministries, and he actually estimates it at somewhere between 20 to 25,000 Jewish believers because of what they've been doing on the ground. Well, not just them and other missionary outreach people, missionaries there. So we're getting closer, but I'll tell you a little bit more later. However, we also have to understand with some 500 to 1,200 years of forced conversions, rampant anti-Semitism, in the 1930s, we may be closer than believe, but only if the gospel is shared with the descendants of those who converted or are hidden within the various church denominations. The second sign, there will be a temple in the last days. Well, of course there's going to be a temple in the last days. How else would it be destroyed or defiled? And we read this. It says, and it shall come to pass in the end of days that the mountain of the Lord's house shall be established as the top of the mountains, and shall be exalted above the hills, and all nations shall flow unto it. This is Isaiah 2:2, and it's also in Micah 4:1. Now, I'm using the JPS, Jewish Publication Society of 1917. It happens to be one of my two favorite Old Testament books because it actually is a more true or a truer translation from the Masoretic Hebrew text into the English text. Now you have to understand that both of these Bibles that I reference and I like a lot, the Jewish Publication Society in 1917 and the Isaac Leeser Bible of 1853, were written by non-believers, and therefore they have taken some liberties to sort of hide some of the scriptures that would reveal to Jews that Jesus is the Messiah. However, they're much better than the current versions. For example, there's a 1985 version of the Jewish Publication Society that's changed a lot. All right, so coming back to the temple will be destroyed and it will be rebuilt. In Matthew 2:4, Jesus tells his disciples that the temple will be destroyed. We read it in, and this is the ESV version. You see all these? Do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down. Now it's also found in Mark 13:2 and in Luke 21:6. So all three synoptic gospels have the same exact prerequisite to his coming. Now we see in Revelation 6:9 that there is an altar of sacrifice which can only be found in the temple. We read in the ESV version, when he opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of those who had been slain for the word of God and for the witness they had borne. We also see the altar of the temple in Revelation 14:18. And another angel came out from the altar, the angel who has authority over the fire, and he called with a loud voice to the one who had the sharp sickle, also the ESV version. Now the temple is going to be defiled as in the days of the Maccabean revolt. So when you see the abomination and the desolation spoken of by the prophet Daniel standing in the holy places, let the reader understand. This is from Matthew 24:15. Now the problem is we don't have the books of Maccabees in the Bible. It's not in the Old Testament canon, it's not in the New Testament canon. Now I have a theory about it, and there's actually three different theories, but I'll tell you what my theory is. You see, you have to understand, when Salome Alexander, I think she was the wife of the 8th Hasmonean emperor, well, when Alexander Jonius, her husband, died, she usurped the throne from her oldest son, Aristobulus II, and she kind of did something really, really strange. At that time, during the Hasmonean Empire, all the Hasmonean kings, you have to understand, were Levites. And, of course, therefore, all the Levites were in the temple. But what she did is she threw out the Sadducees, who were the Levites, and put the Pharisees in charge. And, well, although in rabbinical Judaism she's considered the great peacemaker, you have to understand that to the victor, well, goes the right to write history. And, of course, modern rabbinical Judaism is an outgrowth of the Pharisaical era, and obviously they are not going to put anything in the canon because the rabbis were in charge of the canonization of the Hebrew Scriptures in the 2nd century BC. Obviously, they weren't going to put something in there that would identify the Sadducees as the temple priests. And if they had put the book of Maccabees into the canon, of course the whole world would know that. So they sort of hid it. At least that's my theory. At any rate, Jesus is referring to the prophecy that's actually found in chapter 8 of the book of Daniel. And actually the prophet Daniel prophesied the rise and the fall of Alexander the Great, which I taught 2 weeks ago on the Feast of Dedication from John 10:22. And he also prophesied the division of the empire into the 4 generals, and he also prophesied the rise of Antiochus Epiphanes the fourth, who actually desecrated the first temple. So actually, we guess that's the Zerubbabel's temple. So everything is prophesied in there, and it's told in the 1st and 2nd book of Maccabees, except you don't have it because, well, history was rewritten when the Pharisees became the rabbis, and the rabbis canonized the Old Testament. And if it's not canonized in the Old Testament, it obviously wasn't going to be part of the Protestant Bible. Okay, so we also read about the Antichrist in 2 Thessalonians chapter 2, verse 3. The man of perdition, the Antichrist, must come. This can only happen after the third temple is built and the sacrificial system is actually resumed. Now, 2 years ago, the Temple Institute actually started or reinitiated the sacrificial system. Unfortunately, they tried to do it again this last Passover, and the government actually shut them down. But they have everything ready to go into the new temple. They have all of the artifacts. Well, I shouldn't say the artifacts, all the articles. And although after years and years and years of trying to clone a red heifer, every single one of them had defects. Several years ago, they actually found a pure red heifer with no defects whatsoever. So they even have the red heifer. Only thing they're waiting for right now is for God to destroy the Alaska Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, so that the temple can be built, because they have it all. They have all the materials and everything. I think I read that they can have it up and running in about 6 months. They've already got the Sanhedrin selected. They already are training the Levites, and I myself, being a Levite, I actually have an invitation to go to the Temple Institute through the back door whenever the next time I'm in Israel, and I'm going to take them up on it. Now, also in 2 Thessalonians 2:3, we read it this way. He said, "Let no man deceive you by any means, for that day shall not come except there come a falling away first, and that the man of sin be revealed, the son of perdition." I'm using the King James Version because most people are used to referring to or understanding that the Antichrist is the son of perdition. Excuse me. Now, after Yeshua Jesus tells his disciples of this, all three synoptic gospels recorded their question. We find the question in Matthew 24:3, Mark 13:4, and Luke 21:7. The sign 3 is also found in Matthew 24, verses 4 and 5, verse 11, and verse 26. The followers of Yeshua Jesus will be tempted by false prophets and false messiahs. I didn't read the question, but essentially all three synoptic gospels ask, and it says, so when is this? What are the signs? How are we going to know? So sign 3, as I just said, is, the followers of Yeshua will be tempted by false prophets and false messiahs. Now, there have actually been over 60 false messiahs in the first 2 centuries after Yeshua, after Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. The most famous one is Bar Kokhba, who led the Bar Kokhba revolt. He was actually endorsed by the Sanhedrin as being the Messiah ben David, the Messiah, the king, the conqueror. And he actually led a revolt against the Roman Empire, and as a result of that, that's when the dispersion of all the Jews essentially from the land took place, because Rome was so incensed at the revolt because they lost so many of their centurions that they dispersed all of the Jews. They changed the name of Jerusalem to their own, and they actually named the territory, ancient Israel, after Israel's most vile enemy, what am I thinking? The Philistines. That's where we get the word Palestine from. At any rate, sign 4, there will be wars and rumors of wars. Now, come on, there have been wars and rumors of war for as long as anyone is recording it. I mean, read Josephus' book, The War of the Jews. Sign number 5 is found in Matthew 24. Nations will rise up against other nations. Again, these are wars. Sign number 6 in Matthew 24:7. There will be famine. Famine always follows wars. And there's been famine somewhere around the world for the last several thousands of years. Sign 7, also found in Matthew 24. There's going to be pestilence. Yes, that goes along with it. And sign 8, also in that same verse, Matthew 24:7, there will be earthquakes in various places. Now, what's really interesting is nowadays earthquakes have increased exponentially. Most of that because of oil fracking, getting oil out of shale and getting recovering oil out of sand. And of course, we're affecting the Earth's crust, and there are a lot more earthquakes than there have ever been at any time in history. So we're getting closer. Sign 9 is found in the following verse, Matthew 24:8. It'll be the beginning of sorrows. We read about that in Revelation 6. We read about havoc and death, and we also read about the martyrdom of the redeemed. Now, I know that there's some of that going on because of ISIS around the world today, but we're talking about a worldwide beginning of sorrows, worldwide havoc and death, worldwide martyrdom and redeemed, not regionalized. So we're not there yet. Sign number 10 is found in Matthew 24:9, murder and hatred of the followers of Jesus, of Yeshua, in other words, Christians. And again, although this is happening regionally now, we're not there yet because it's not happening on a global scale. But currently we have ISIS, or ISIL is the current version of that, and they are in, they pretty much are defeated in Iraq and Syria, but they've spread all over the world now. We also have the liberals in government that do not like Christians. They've identified Christians primarily as a hate groups. And of course, we have the Supreme Court of the United States that's also, shall I say, aiding to sign number 10. How about sign number 11? That's found in Matthew 24:6. It's also found, as I said earlier, in Mark 13 and in Luke 21. Betrayal among believers? Yeah. Sign 12, Matthew 24:12. It's evil on earth will be magnified. It will be like the days of Noah. Now, I'm going to talk about this a little later, but we find this in Matthew 24:37. But a lot of people don't realize how evil the earth really was because it's not in the Bible. We just read that there was evil on the earth. We read about the Nephilim, the fallen ones, and their descendants, the Nephilim giants. But if you look at the historical and cultural books, you find a lot more information about how evil it really was. Sign number 13, believers will fall out of belief. That's found in Matthew 24:12. Sign number 14, found in Matthew 24:14. The gospel will be spread around the world. What's really interesting now is now we have third world countries that are sending their missionaries to Europe and to the United States because churches are closing because believers are leaving. I mean, the churches are in serious problems in Europe and even in the United States. Sign number 15 is found in Matthew 15. There will be evil monuments built in holy places. Churches, as I said, are closing all over the place, and Islam is converting these churches into mosques. That's what the Al-Aqsa Mosque is on the Temple Mount. When Islam conquered Jerusalem, the first thing they did is they built a mosque on the Temple Mount because that's their monument. That's how they actually claim ownership. Sign number 16 is found in Matthew 24:19. Women will stop having babies. We already know we have an increase in that. We have an increase in abortion, Roe v. Wade. We have birth control issues. We have homosexuality, sexuality. We have the LGBTQ movement that's really taken on steam in the last couple of years. Sign 17, there'll be great tribulation, suffering, and misfortune. While today some people around the world are living through what is perceived to be the Great Tribulation, I believe it will be much worse when it actually begins. And it will be global. Sign number 18, there'll be lightning in the skies. Perhaps solar flares or laser technology as a result of a global war. Perhaps during the War of Gog and Magog, which I'm going to be talking about in a little bit in a little more detail. That's found in Matthew 24:27. And as I read Scripture, all of these signs come before the Great Tribulation. Matthew 24:29 uses the Greek words eutheos, and meta, denoting that this happens after the Great Tribulation begins. This is a misinterpretation by many, shall I say, Bible teachers, because they don't actually translate they don't look at the Greek. When we read Matthew 24:29 in Greek, it is clearly saying that these following signs are going to happen only after the tribulation starts. Now, I'm a pre-tribber, so fortunately, I don't believe I'm going to be witnessing any of these. But there are some people who are mid-tribbers or post-tribbers, and we have 7 years of tribulation, so they may feel that they're going to be experiencing some of this, such as, the people in Iraq and Syria and in other parts of the world where ISIS controls, they may believe that, well, they're experiencing the Great Tribulation, but again, I believe it's going to be a global event, not a regional event, and certainly not a global event. So after the tribulation starts, Matthew 24:29, we have a few more signs. We have sign number 19, which we find in Matthew 24:29 and also in Joel 3:15. The sun and the moon and the stars will darken. This is after the tribulation starts, and this is bringing or announcing the return of Yeshua, the return of Jesus. Now, I know a lot of people, well, some people, made a lot of money on the lunar tetrads and the eclipses that have happened in the last several years, and I taught about that, I think, when I was teaching about why September 23rd wasn't going to be the end of the world. So you might want to click on that one. I think I've linked it to my Facebook page, and you can find it. Sign 20. Is found in Joel 2:31, Acts 2:20, and Revelation 6:12. The sun shall be turned into darkness and the moon into blood. I just talked about that. Then we have sign 21. It shall be as the days of Noah. I already mentioned this earlier. That's Matthew 24:37. Now, I think we're partially there because we have genetically modified organisms. We've been crossbreeding dogs for over 3,000 years, so we've been there for quite some time. Harvesting of human parts is relatively new with Planned Parenthood. Genetic engineering, as I said, has been going on for 3,000 years, but now we've reached, or shall we say, we've embarked on a new phase of that nowadays. While Matthew in verse 24:37 is speaking of the rapture, I believe, it may also be speaking of the people who are left behind in the Great Tribulation. While there will be a great evil on earth, the historical cultural books reveal that there was much more evil on earth during the time of Noah than most people are really aware of, as I mentioned earlier. So Matthew 24:37, when it's talking about the times of Noah, I believe it's talking about the rapture, how we'll be taken up in a moment, and then there'll be people left behind. Now, some people might say, well, because this is coming after the tribulation begins, well, maybe we're not going to be taken up or raptured pre-tribulation. Maybe it'll be mid-tribulation. Well, you have to understand, as I mentioned earlier, Psalm 90, verse 4, God is omnipotent. And I also mentioned that Peter actually quoted it in his second letter in chapter 3, verse 8, where to the Lord is 1,000 years is like a day, and a day is like 1,000 years. And so, although I put most of this in chronological order because Jesus put it in chronological order as recorded in all three synoptic gospels, I also believe that we're talking about the people that are left behind at the time that Yeshua is coming. But you have to understand, the rapture takes place before he's coming, as I just mentioned. All right, so while Matthew 24:37, as I said, is like the times of Noah, it's placed, as I said, it's chronologically after the tribulation begins, prophesying the rapture to those left behind in the Great Tribulation. I believe that it is also precedes the rapture of the believers to some extent. Now, sign 22, the heavens will shake as Yeshua, Jesus, returns. So this is simultaneous. So when we experience that, it's after all the other signs have happened, and Yeshua, Jesus, is coming. Now, because we read in Matthew 24:36, we don't know when that time is. Only the Father is going to know, and I talk about that in my teaching on the ancient Jewish wedding ceremony, which is the way that the Bible is structured, and the followers of Yeshua in his day knew that. So we have to be ready. And the question that I started this teaching with is, are you ready? Because we don't know. So let's talk about the return of Messiah. The Son of Man will come in a cloud. We find that in Matthew 24:30. But as you can tell from the signs out there right now, all of our ducks are not in a row. There's still a couple of things that actually have to happen before Yeshua, before Jesus comes. Number one, the temple has to be rebuilt. Now, the architectural plans are finished. As I mentioned earlier, the items have all been produced. The Temple Institute has done that. The Levites have all been trained. The Sanhedrin has been assembled. And the high priest has already been appointed. So that's done. Still to come, however, enough believers in Jerusalem to welcome Yeshua Jesus back. We don't know what the term enough means, and only the Father knows that. And the third temple must be built, because we have to have the man of perdition that is actually going to convince the entire world that he is the great peacemaker. And then, of course, we also have the scriptural wars, which I'm going to talk about. The War of Gog and Magog. You see, almost everybody is in agreement that the War of Gog and Magog will precede the Messiah's second coming. I said almost everybody, not everybody. But then there's the Psalm 83 war. Some scholars believe that there will be a war before the War of Gog and Magog, which is described in Psalm 83. Is Psalm 83 prophetically predicting such a war? Well, Psalm 83 verses 1 through 4, this is my Lisa Bible. It's the introduction plus the first three verses. A song of Psalm of Asaph. God, take no rest for thyself, be not silent, and keep not still. For lo, thy enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up their head. Against thy people they take crafty secret devices, and they consult against those thou protectest, meaning Israel. In verse 5, from the Psalm of Asaph, we read, They have said, come and let us cut them off from being a nation, and the name of Israel shall be remembered no more. Well, isn't this what the Palestinians, what Hamas, what Hezbollah, and the rest of the Arab world is trying to do? If East Jerusalem is given to the Palestinians as their capital, all of the biblical holy sites will be in that capital. None will be on the Israeli side of Jerusalem. Now, UNESCO has already classified the Temple Mount and the Western Wall by their Muslim names only. Some say this is history, but isn't this happening today? The language is the same. From the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is the slogan of the Palestinians and their followers, and also the BDS, Boycott, Divest, and Sanction. Some of these people are still here. Psalm 83, verses 6 and 7, this is the GPS version, the tabernacles of Edom and the Ishmaelites, those two are still here, of Moab and the Hagarenes, Gibal and Ammon, and Amalek, the Philistines with the inhabitants of Tyre, or Tyre. All right, so that is right out of the Psalm, verses 6 and 7. Although we cannot identify these people by their ancient names, Scripture tells us where they settled. These are Muslim nations surrounding the modern-day Israel. Both Ishmael and Esau, also known in Scripture as Edom, settled to the east. God says he will have war with Amalek from generation to generation. That's found in Exodus 17:16. The book of Esther tells us that Haman was an Agagite, a descendant of Amalek. That's in Esther 3:1. Based on this book, then Amalek is in ancient Persia. Today, this is modern-day Iran. Ezekiel 36 and 37 tells us, if we read in verses 1 through 4 in Ezekiel 36, it says, "Speak of the land being left desolate and the Israelites' removal from the land." That's what they talk about. In Ezekiel 36:6 through Ezekiel 37:38, the land is revitalized and the Israelites are prophesied to return to the land promised to Abraham, to Isaac, and to Jacob. This prophecy was fulfilled on May 14th, 1948, when modern-day Israel was established. So, let's talk about the War of Gog and Magog. Who are the antagonists? On Wednesday, September 30th, 2015, the world did a proverbial 180-degree shift. The United States of America was kicked out of the Middle East, and we were no longer the world's foremost superpower. And NATO lost its status in the world at that time also. Russia then formed an alliance with Iran and Syria. In the following days, China joined their alliance. Turkey and Lebanon. Lebanon is controlled by Hezbollah, the prodigy of Iran and one of Israel's most dangerous adversaries at the present time. Now you see, Turkey and Lebanon were already allied with Iran. The Palestinian organization, the PLO, and the joint government with Hamas, aka the Muslim Brotherhood. Most people don't realize that Hamas is a chapter of and formed out of the Muslim Brotherhood. They withdrew from the Oslo Accord, essentially declaring war on Israel. And just last week, they said they would never recognize Israel as a state or as a nation. While we now have a new administration in the United States, these alliances still stand. What's the significance? Well, Ezekiel 38:1 and 2, this is the JPS version, "And the word of the Lord came unto me, saying, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal, and prophesy against him." So we're talking about a person. So who is Gog? Where is the land of Magog? Who is the prince of Meshach and Tubal? Well, many people believe Gog is the dictator of Russia. Until September 30th, 2015, there has been a lot of debate over this. Why? Because they were predicting a coalition based on Scripture with Iran, Libya, Algeria, Sudan, Turkey, and other key Islamic nations. Now the debate is now over. The coalition has formed. Another reason for the debate? Misinterpretation of the Hebrew. Some versions of the Bible, the ASV, the BBE, the Modern King James Version, the New King James Version, and others add Rosh as meaning Russia to Ezekiel 38:2, assuming that Ezekiel was prophesying a future nation thousands of years before Russia became a nation. Well, what about the name Rus? Rus was a Slavic territory later known as Russia in the late 19th century. It became the Union of the Soviet Socialist Republic, also known as the Soviet Union, after the Bolshevik Revolution. In 1991, the Soviet Union was dissolved. The dissolution of the Soviet Union, well, when the Soviet Union was dissolved in 1991, it was divided into 15 separate entities. They were the Ukraine, Belarus, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Estonia, Georgia, Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldova, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Russia. That was a mouthful. In the Hebrew context, Ezekiel 38:2 reads, Ben Adam sim panecha el gag eretz hamegag nasi rosh meshach vetubal veneba aliv. Now, I forgot to tell you my rule. If I say something in Hebrew, you're supposed to repeat it. Actually, I just read it. All right, let me give you the English translation. Son of man, look toward Gog of the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal, and prophesy against him. Now, the authoritative version of the King James Bible, this is the 1611, says exactly that. Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal, and prophesy against him. Now, Ezekiel 38:2 and 3 from the Jewish Publication Society says, Son of man, set thy face against Gog, the land of Magog, the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal, and prophesy against him. And say, Thus saith the Lord God, Behold, I am against thee, O Gog, the chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. It's a very, very clear explanation and translation. So who is Gog? This prophecy is speaking of a person who is one of many, but the chief prince or the head ruler of the coalition of the nations who are the descendants of Japheth, one of the sons of Noah, who settled north of the Black Sea. You see, the Hebrew word Rosh means head. It doesn't mean Russia. It means the leader. This is why Bible translators translated it to chief prince of Meshach and Tubal. The prophet was not naming a future country. That being said, however, when we look at where the descendants of Japheth settled after the flood, it does point to some nations that were part of the former Soviet Union. So who are Magog, Meshach, and Tubal? Genesis 10:2. You have to go back to the book of Genesis 10:2. I'm using the JPS version. It's also known as the Table of Nations if you want to Google it and you want to download a table. The sons of Japheth are Gomer, sorry, my English accent came out there. I deleted my R. Gomer and Magog and Madai and Javan and Tubal and Meshach and Tyre. So we have three of the sons there, Magog, Tubal, and Meshach. Granted, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 of them, but we only read of those three in Ezekiel 38. Now, doing some detective work, we find that Flavius Josephus, the first century Roman historian, wrote in his book, the famous book, The Antiquities of the Jews, that the people of Magog are the people whom the Greeks call the Scythians. Doing some additional detective work, we find this is a critical clue because we know from history that the Scythians were a people group that migrated from the Middle East northward and settled north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Furthermore, from there, Magog settled first in Georgia, south of the Caucasus Mountains, and the descendants of Magog, the Scythians, also became, they became Russians, but they also became Belarusians and Ukrainians. Today that region is known as the former Soviet Union, and while a small sliver of current Russia touches both the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. So it could be Russia, but it's not, because the prophet Ezekiel identified a future nation. Ezekiel 38:15 says that Gog will come from your place out of the remote parts of the north. Ezekiel 39:2 says Gog will come from the remotest part of the north and come against the mountains of Israel. The country that is farthest to the north in relationship to Israel is in fact Russia. But you also have Turkey, and we also have Georgia in between. Actually, is it Georgia? Yeah, yes, it is. Additionally, so while scholars may have identified Russia for the wrong reason, saying that the Hebrew word rush was identifying a future country, the country that is the farthest to the north in relationship to Israel is beyond Turkey and Georgia, and it is in fact Russia. As a matter of fact, if you go straight north out of Jerusalem, guess what city lies straight due north? Moscow. So although these prognosticators or these scholars predict it's Russia, it may not be that far north. Who knows? Scholars have speculated that the Russian dictator will build a diplomatic and military coalition to surround and attack the state of Israel in the end times, when right now it looks like we're there. The question is, what countries are part of the future coalition from Scripture? Ezekiel 38:5. Well, the first ally of Russia would be Persia. Until 1935, of course, Persia was the legal name of the country that we now know as Iran. See, in 1935, Persia changed its name to Iran from its closest ally, Nazi Germany, identifying itself as Aryan. Until September 30th, 2015, the alliance between Russia and Iran was thought to be formed in the last days to attack Israel. Now, with Russia building nuclear plants in Iran, and Iran on the guaranteed path to a nuclear bomb, and the two nations being partners in a coalition of those nations who hate Israel, has this been accelerated? Okay, let's talk about the next country, Cush. Ezekiel 35 tells us that another country is in alliance. Will be what many English Bibles actually translate into Ethiopia. The Hebrew word, however, is Cush, which is the Upper Nile region that we know as Sudan. While the current state of Ethiopia may also be involved in the war, the focus is really Sudan, which today, of course, is a radical Islamic Sunni state closely allied with Iran and Russia, and deeply anti-Semitic and anti-Israel. Okay, now let's talk about Put. We also find Put in Ezekiel 38:5. Josephus identifies Put as the ancient Libyos, the territory that today is called Libya and Algeria. Increasingly, both countries today are deeply hostile to Israel and closely allied with Russia also. Who's Gomer now? Ezekiel 38:6. When one does the historical detective work, one learns that Gomer is what we now call Turkey, due north of Israel. For much of the past 80 years, it didn't make sense that Turkey would turn against Israel. Why? Because Turkey was a NATO ally and a friend of Israel, the United States, and the European Union. But in the last few years, the Turkish government has swung dramatically away from the West towards Russia and Iran and become deeply hostile toward the state of Israel. With the failed coup d'etat in July 15th of 2016, the president of Turkey, Tayyip Erdogan, has solidified himself as the supreme ruler of the Islamic State of Turkey. Now, earlier in 2016, he, meaning Erdogan, declared that the Ottoman Empire was never conquered and that he was the caliph of the Ottoman Empire. Bet you didn't read that in the local newspapers. So who is Togama from Ezekiel 38:6? This is the Turkic-speaking peoples that spread out from Turkey across the Caucasus and across into Central Asia. Now, we can't be certain precisely which modern nation state from this area will join the anti-Israel alliance. It can be any or all of them. These are almost all Muslim countries with close links to Russia and Iran. Let me show you a map. We have Little Israel. Let's see if we can get this showing up here. We have Little Israel. I don't know if you can see this. And this is Ezekiel 38, and these are the Ezekiel 38 enemies. Look, in the little red circle over there, you have teeny little Israel, and I have identified Ethiopia to the south, Sheba and Dedan from Ezekiel 38:13 also to the south. I see Put all the way to the west. You've got Gomer and Togarmah and Meshach and Magog to the north, and then you have Persia to the east. So if you couldn't see those, I have them identified there. These are all of those nations that are identified in Genesis chapter 10, the Table of Nations, and also identified in Ezekiel 38. I hope you can see that. If you can't, text me and I'll send you a copy of the map. Now, what about Lebanon and Syria? While Lebanon and Syria are not mentioned in Ezekiel 38 as part of the War of Gog and Magog, events have drawn them into the discussion as Russia's primary role in the Middle East since September 30th of 2015 to prop up the Assad regime in Syria has solidified. And now the Assad regime seems to have been solidified as the United States and its coalition under the Trump administration, along with Russia, have actually pretty much driven ISIS out of control in Syria and in Iraq. But you see, under the Obama administration, the United States has built up Iran with nearly $2 billion in ransom money. And Iran has in turn built up her principal terrorist organization, Hezbollah, which is actually now in control of Lebanon, against Israel. Both Iran and Hezbollah have long-range missiles capable of hitting any target in Israel, while Russia has shored up Iran and presumably Hezbollah's defenses against any Israeli strike with the most sophisticated missile defense system in the world. The good news is, Ezekiel 38:14 through Ezekiel 39:29, the Lord will defeat the forces which shall come against Israel. We read in Ezekiel 38:4, and I will turn thee back and put hooks in thy jaws, and I will bring thee forth, and all thine army, horses and horsemen, all of them clothed with all sorts of armor, even a great company with bucklers and shields, all of them handling swords. See, while Peter believed he was in the last days 2,000 years ago, he also knew, as we do, that God is omnipotent and omnipresent, as I mentioned earlier. This meant for Peter, as it does for us also, that we have no idea how long the last days would or will last. While Peter was in the beginning of the last days, we are near the end. How many we have left, only the Father knows. For as the psalmist wrote in Psalm 90, verse 4, And Peter paraphrased it in his second letter, chapter 3, verse 8. But beloved, be not ignorant of this one thing, that one day is with the Lord as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years as one day. This is from the King James Version. I myself believe in the pre-tribulation rapture, but I was wrong once. I, like Peter, do not know if the War of Gog and Magog comes before or after the Messiah's return. I also do not know if there will be a Psalm 83 war before the War of Gog and Magog. It appears from Ezekiel 38:10 through 15 that Israel is living in peace with much wealth, suggesting that Israel's closest enemies today have been dispersed and or defeated before the War of Gog and Magog, suggesting that a Psalm 83 war was waged and won. One thing that is apparent today is that Russia has elevated itself to a superpower during the Obama administration. The United States of America, our country, under the Trump administration, is attempting to regain that status. The drumbeats are being heard in Israel. 2 years ago, China joined Russia and Syria and Iraq and started flying sorties together with Russia, and had moved the largest submarine in the world with over 20 ICBM missiles and 200 nuclear warheads within striking distance of Israel. That was 2 years ago. Russia has also had its fleet in the Mediterranean for several years now. They have given the most effective anti-missile system to Iran and Syria and presumably Hezbollah. They also have several military bases in Israel's neighbor Syria, and Iran's recently established one. While all of these signs are significant, one of the signs to watch for is in Matthew 23, verses 37 through 39. In these verses, Yeshua, Jesus, says that we will not see him again until there are enough Jewish believers in Jerusalem as he did when he entered Jerusalem on Palm Sunday some 2,000 years ago. At the present time, there aren't enough of God's remnant, the Jewish believers, in Israel and Jerusalem for this to occur, but this could change. In August of 2015, the Israeli government started considering using DNA testing to determine if a person was Jewish instead of the current maternal system being used. Now, about DNA testing, I don't believe that the law of return will change under the current right-wing coalition government in Israel. However, I do believe that within the next several years, that law will change, and thousands of Christians whose grandparents, great-grandparents who have hidden their ancestry to avoid persecution since the Spanish Inquisition will have their DNA tested to make aliyah, which is the Hebrew word for to immigrate. Aliyah means to ascend, since Jerusalem is on a hill. And this would then, in turn, foster in Yeshua, Jesus' return. While current DNA testing is being used for profit of those companies marketing DNA testing, comparing the DNA of their control groups to show connections to relatives in various parts of the world, the future of forensic DNA testing will most likely have to be used by the Israeli government to implement or be implemented in determining a genetic connection and thereby ethnicity by genetics for Israeli citizen, or excuse me, for Israeli citizenship. As too many Christians are hoping to find out if they have Hebrew roots. I have probably at least a half a dozen people that come to my Bible study that have really are interested in this, and I've run into dozens and dozens of people that believe that they have Jewish genealogy. Additionally, there will come a time when America and Canadian Jews will no longer be welcome as anti-Semitism drives more and more Jews home. In other words, to the land of Israel, to Eretz Yisrael. So I ask you to pray that Jews, Gentiles of all faiths, including Muslims, will come to know the Messiah, will come to know Yeshua, will come to know Jesus. Matthew 5 verses 13 says, "You are salt, the salt of the earth, but if the salt has lost its taste, how shall its saltiness be restored? It is no longer good for anything except to be thrown out and trampled under people's feet." Verse 14, "You are the light of the world. A city set on a hill cannot be hidden. Be salt and light." Verse 15, "Nor do people light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a stand where it gives light to all in the house." Next verse, "In the same way, let your light shine before others, so that they may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." This is the ESV version. What I say to you is, be the salt and the light. Don't sit on your laurels. Don't wait for somebody else to share the gospel with your friends, with your acquaintances, with strangers. We have a tendency to wait and hold back and say, well, hope somebody else will actually share the gospel. No. You and I need to share the gospel. That's why I'm doing these Facebook Lives. This is the new street ministry. I can reach more people this way because I'm sharing my live teaching with you. I hope you will share this video with people on your Facebook page and through other social media. And I leave you with this. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he turn his face toward you. May he lift his countenance upon you and give you peace. B'Shem Yeshua Mishachenu.
Good teaching.
And it cut off. It didn't finish that. Shalom, if you're still here.